Hello and welcome my Varieties for students. This is lecture 2. Last time we started with an actual stylistic analysis to Deacon's extract taken from Hard Times chapter 5. We limited our analysis to the three main aspects of layout, which are paragraphing, graphology, and punctuation as well. And before that, we discussed that stylistic analysis of literary text basically examine the text in terms of the patterns of language use. And this is where we can induce or understand the author's style. Okay, and the aim is to evaluate the quality of the text by pinpointing the deviate, basically stylistic features and their impact on the reading material as well as on the readers themselves. Now, if we go back to the previous aspects, we talked about the use of for example, punctuation, and we also talked about features of paragraphing, and we saw that most paragraphs and narratives tend to be really well organized, especially as far as descriptive narratives are concerned. And we saw that the stylistic function for this is to emphasize the organized nature of literature and also to organize the reader's ideas and progression of reading and comprehension. As far as for graphological devices, in fact, all devices of capitalization, underlining, bold type, and italics are all widely used, and they are mostly used for emphasis. Now, whenever you come across a word that is wholly capitalized, or a word that is underlined, or written in bold facing, or in italics, pay attention to these words, because these words are important in the text and in the context of the narrative. Also, we talked about figures and diagrams, and we saw that they play no role in literature, because literature has an independent nature and it doesn't really bank on any kind of diagrams or tables or pictures or illustrations in order to convey and make the message of the text across. It doesn't rely on any figures, charts, tables, unlike, for example, journalistic articles or scientific reports. They play a major role, but for literary texts, they play no role. We also expanded on the use of punctuation, and we saw that they are of paramount importance, and they are really highly significant in literature. The comma, for example, is so popular, but sometimes it is dropped, and the vital or the crucial role of commas, for example, are to mark a mini unit inside the sentence and make the process of reading easier, especially that the writers and authors love to make the sentences long and complex, so they have to stick together so many ideas into one sentence, and so there is no other way to do it but by using commas, so they can break up the sentences into mini units, and in the end they can build or compose a whole semantic unit. And also the commas are used for interruptions, like when we have an interruptive clause, we use it, we actually put it between two commas. And we use it also for parallelism, and parallelism reflect a kind of harmony and oratory to the text. For the semicolons, they are also extensively employed in literary texts, especially in narratives. Semicolons are used interchangeably with the full stops, but the thing about them is that they suggest a stronger link among consecutive sentences. So the writers would use full stop instead of the semicolons, but they always prefer the semicolons because semicolons suggest that the upcoming sentence is of great relation and connection to the previous one. Okay, so we are expanding on the same ideas, perhaps independently, but these ideas are broken up by means of semicolons. It means that they are all interrelated in a way or another. For the questions or for the question marks, they are used when with self questions and for rhetorical questions. The exclamation marks are also used frequently to express exclamation, surprise, irony, sarcasm, and both question marks and exclamation marks are used and exploited for means of communicating readers indirectly, and also to draw readers into the reader material more and more. That was all about lecture 1. Now let's move to the next slide to find out about today's lesson. So this is the outline of our today's lesson. In fact, we're moving to a new level of stylistic analysis. We will be examining precisely the phraseology and the wording of narrative literary text. We will be starting with sentence structure, including the complexity of sentences and grammaticality of sentences, parallel sentence structure, and versions of sentence elements. Basically, these are the aspects of literary sentence structure. Of course, we're gonna be discussing each point with some supporting examples from Deacon's text. Then we will be moving to clause structure in terms of verbless clauses, parallel clauses, and noun phrases, verb phrases, some aspects of verb phrases like simplicity of verb phrase, tense, and voice. After that, we will look at the diction or wording of the text. This comprises adjectives, adverbs, sentence connectors, personal pronouns, and modal verbs. And as usual, we're gonna wrap it up with a home assignment due to next week. In this section, we will look at the nature of sentence structure in literary text. And indeed, one of the most striking features of sentence structure is their complexity and their, their use of long and lengthy sentences. And in fact, this is not to make a task of reading hard on the readers, but this is actually done for many stylistic functions indeed. So the sentences in literary text are often complex and complicated. The structure of sentences are usually lengthy with interrelated clauses and phrases. And just to remind you that maybe you studied this back in your composition classes, is that in English we have three different sentences. We have or three types of sentences. We have simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. All right. In simple sentences, we have a simple sentence made of one idea, and we don't have any use of connectors or coordinators or conjunctions. While in compound sentence, we have two simple sentences that are joined by means of a coordinator. In complex sentence is a sentence that contains one independent and at least one subordinate clause. And the main clause is a phrase that would make sense if it were a sentence on its own, whereas a subordinate clause will not form a sentence on its own. The purpose of using complex sentence is that the writers insist on making fluent flow of phrases and clauses, and hence many ideas to constitute one main idea, the sentence. Okay, so instead of breaking up or make a kind of a breakdown in the reader's progression of reading by means of full stops and so on, they would always use complex sentences to expand on the same idea within one sentence. Now, generally, these are the four important features of sentence structure in any literary language. So, first, we have complexity of sentences. Second, we have angrammaticality of sentences. Third, parallel sentence structure. We will find out that writers actually rely on the use of parallelism in language as to achieve a kind of harmony and oratory as well as beauty in the language. And also inversion of sentence elements, where sometimes writers start with the predicate instead of the subject, or sometimes they start with the subordinate clauses and finally they come up with the main clause. So the language is always manipulated in their own accordance and at their will. Each of these elements is going to be discussed with examples in the upcoming slides. To begin with the first aspect of sentence structure and literary text, the first one is complexity of sentences. A perfect example that shows the complicated nature of literary sentences is the last sentence of the second paragraph in Dickens' text. You can find it on page 257. The last sentence actually is quite complex and consists of many clauses. I'll read out the sentence and I want you to pay attention to the main clause and to the subordinate clauses. Count how many they are. So it contains several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday, and tomorrow, and every counterpart of the last and the next. In fact, Dickens couldn't write it actually better than this. And you see here the insistence of making many different ideas in one single unit here. This is to focus on the idea of the ugliness and the inchangeability of Cocktown City, especially that it is, uh, you know, becoming very dreary for its inhabitants. Everything is like and equally unpleasant. Life is monotonous. This is the key word that describes these whole events or these whole sentences, is that uh, the writer wants to highlight this idea. It is made emphatic by the the structure of the sentence. Um, Dickens um, succeeds actually at making this foregrounded idea of Cocktown City. Okay, the life is monotonous, workers' life is hard, uh, and these are just some of the aspects of the Cocktown City. So the sentence is prominently complex in nature. It consists of one phrase and 8 clauses, the first one being the main clause, and the remaining 7 are subordinate clauses. The stylistic function of the complexity of sentences is for coherence purposes, but for most is to blow phrases and clauses in a tighter way in order to represent the idea, as it is here, that shows the monotonous nature of Cocktown City. It is all put in one single unit rather than making it into multiple sentences. So this is beautifully done by Charles Dickens. The second aspect of sentence structure in literature is their ungrammaticality. Some sentences can be ill-formed, having no subject, verb, or other main categories of sentences. And we all know that the chief components are necessary to every grammatically complete sentence, that are the subject and the predicate, but sometimes they are dropped out um, deliberately by the authors for many different stylistic functions. For example, this sentence, which is taken from Dickens' text again, a town so sacred to fact, so triumphant in its assertions, of course got on well. Why no? Not quite well. No, dear me. Okay, so in this sentence we can find some ungrammatical examples, and it is clear that in this sentence we have some manifestations of spoken language, that the speaker here is basically talking to himself and posing some self questions, and he's answering as well himself. The grammatical versions of these questions are as follows. Um, it was a town so sacred to fact and so triumphant in its assertions, of course. It got on well. No, why no? Not quite well. No, dear me. So the underlined bold faceted words are added in this reconstructed version. So remember that such deviance from grammatical norms of English is perfectly normal and readily welcome in literary language. Okay, if we are to ask about the stylistic function of such deviance, why to drop out the chief components that are necessary to every grammatically complete sentence, such as the subject or the predicate. In fact, it has the function of emphasizing statements and evidently shows the superiority of the message over grammar. It's clear that even Charles dropped out some chief components in the sentence. Still, the message is still clear and it's still there and we can get it easily. One more aspect of sentence structure in literary text is the parallel structure use. Authors, writers, poets have this kind of weird infatuation with the use of parallel structure, because parallel structures are, you know, are part of the aesthetic use of language. They add harmony to the sentences, and also they boost the oratory of the language, and also they enhance the beauty of the text. Parallel sentences are frequent in literary language to reflect sameness of meaning and syntax, and to mark rhythmical language. They are very much rhythmic. Please go to page 258 to read the example. Then came the teetotal society, and then came the chemist and the druggist, then came the experienced chaplain into jail, then came Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby. The parallel starts off for long consecutive sentences, marks the similarity of meaning and the staging of events, one after another in order. Okay, so this is why Charles Dickens used this kind of structure in order to show the chronological order of these events. The fourth and the last aspect of sentence structure is inversion of sentence elements. It is common in literary language to have the sentence elements inverted. This is more recurrent indeed in poetry than in prose. In Dickens' text, for example, we have then came repeated 4 times. Here we have the verb and then the subject, which is quite unusual in ordinary everyday use of language. We usually start with the subject and then the verb. Okay, so here we have a sentence that begins with the verb and then with the subject. So we may title this as a verb subject inversion. So came. The second example, victuals and drinks were the whole of her diet. Clear example of inversion as well. So if we are to reconstruct the this example, we would put it this way: the whole of her diet was victuals and drinks. Okay, not victuals and drinks were the whole of her diet. So here we have a complement verb inversion. We should have started with the verb first. So the whole of her diet was victuals and drinks. We cannot say that this is ungrammatical, but this is simply inverted or inversions of sentence elements in literary texts, which are commonplace in most of literary work. We may say that the function of such inversion or inversions in narrative is for emphasis. Sometimes when you want to emphasize an idea, or you want to emphasize the sentence, then came the king. It's like, oh, after a very long time the king has finally arrived. So instead of saying then the king came, no, you would put it then came the king. Okay, this is for emphatic reasons, and sometimes it could be done to achieve more aesthetic effect, so that makes reading entertaining and less boring. To sum up the first part of our session today, sentences and narratives are usually complex and at times complicated, and grammatical sentences are commonplace in narratives. Parallel sentences are frequent in literary texts of all types. Inversions of sentence elements is used for emphatic and aesthetic purposes. So, one more important feature of clause structure is the heavy use of parallel clauses. Parallel structure is a syntactic device and a grammatical construction having two or more clauses, phrases, or words with similar grammatical form and length. In parallel structure, sentences have a series of phrases or clauses which start and end in almost a similar fashion by keeping the rhythm of the lines. Study this example, which is cited in Dickens' text. The jail might have been the infirmary. The infirmary might have been the jail. The town hall might have been either. Okay. Another example, we can find it in the upcoming slide. That's it. This is the example. The Makchokumachite school was all fact, and the school of design was all fact, and the relations between master and a man were all fact. So as you can notice here, that parallelism in these examples serve to give phrases a pattern and rhythm, and most importantly, it balances between the ideas and the arguments that are equally important. So we may simply maybe simply say that parallelism is done to reflect the rhythmical and aesthetic nature of literary text in the first place, and also to enhance the meaning in these sentences, or to make them emphatic by organizing them in this way. Now let's move to another part of stylistic analysis, the part of noun phrases. Noun phrases are generally simple and monosyllabic in literary language. However, they can be quite complex sometimes. Both pre and post modifications are frequent, and mostly in poetry indeed. Look at these examples of nouns found in Dickens' text: fact, river, jail, church, force, world, town, and more. The function of these simple nouns is to make the task of reading and comprehension easy. However, this isn't always. Complex noun phrases are also common in literary language. Writers such as Dickens, Connor, Joyce, Beck, Henry James are famous for coinage and using newly invented complex nouns more than any other writers. The only example that can be cited from Dickens' text is Makchokumachilde, which is a name of school. It's quite strange and long and doesn't basically exist in English. So the stylistic function of the complexity of a noun is to feel grounded, is to make readers think about it, ponder what it really means. So they try to divide the words, these complex nouns, and to come up with something meaningful behind them. So sometimes it is done for the sake of irony and satire, or for sheer comedy. In fact, the name of the school seems like choke the child. It is a joke, suggesting that the school gives the child so many unnecessary facts and information that it chokes them. That is to say, the system of schooling is useless and damaging to the children. Now, this is very uh, sarcastic kind of style. When we account for the verb phrase and literary text, we usually consider the following aspects. First of all, simplicity or complexity of verb phrase and the tense as well as the voice. The first characteristic of verb phrase is simplicity of verb phrase. Verbs are usually simple in literary language. The following features of verb phrases of some importance here. Uh, Usually, verbs are simple and mainly unisyllabic to make the task of understanding easier and communication between writers and readers better. Look at these examples from Dickens' text. Walked, was, had, stood, got, contained, went, were, and asked. They are all clear and made of one word. However, sometimes the verb can be complex, consisting of three words like would have been. Yet it is not complicated and cannot be considered as an obstacle, for example, to easy reading and comprehension. Another aspect is the tense. The overwhelming tense is the simple sentence or past narrative sentences as events take place in the past. We cannot imagine a narration that is used by simple sentence or by simple present or future. Narratives are always uh, written in simple past plus uh, past narrative tenses like past continuous or past perfect. However, all other tenses might be used in dialogues between characters. As for the voice, the active voice is generally more recurrent than the passive, yet passive voice can be used at instances when writers want to hide something for its unimportance or to keep it unknown temporarily or permanently for some reason. Okay, so voice also depends on the writer's style, and the voice also reflects formality of style, like when they use the passive voice or the active voice. Usually we use the active, not the passive, but when the passive is used, it simply reflects the formality of style. Now let's move to adjectives. Adjectives are the amicable flavor of literary language. They are used for description, accuracy of description, of course, exaggeration, and aesthetic effect. Usually they have a simple structure, one word, but they can be also occasionally complex, two or more words. For example, ill smelling. Or we can simply say stinky. So adjectives are used a lot in order to make narration vivid, and they help with the uh, imagery and the descriptions as well. They can also occur in a series of descriptive predicative adjectives, for example, fluoride, wooden, legs. Okay. Intensifiers are also widely used in this variety to reflect exaggeration. For example, so much very, and to, and extreme. Just like adjectives, adverbs of all types are popular in literary language. They are of considerable importance to meaning and perception, especially when it comes to description of events or of actions. Writers sometimes mobilize them in accordance to their importance to the context. In Deacon's text, for example, some adverbs are foregrounded by being fronted. For example, they made it with sometimes a bill. Okay, now in this example, sometimes here is situated after with, which is basically an unusual position. Normally it is sometimes with, okay, but here the the conjunction with is fronted before the word, the adverb sometimes. Sentence connectors are vital in literary language. These are some examples of sentence connectors. We have connectors of addition like and, connectors of contrast like but, or connectors of reason like because. Other connectors like those of result and conclusion, for example, finally or in the end, in the conclusion, as well as enumerations first, second, and third, are completely absent in literature, and they are very strange and never used. As for modal verbs such as can, could, would, etc., are recurrently used, especially those of probability and ability. Okay. However, verbs of obligation such as must, ought to, should are not used for literary material, and they are usually used in direct communication between the writer and the reader.